Hey, Brian, the highest court of appeals in the state of New York just rejected Donald Trump's attempt to get his gag order tossed out. So, it's been pretty much a clean sweep. Every judge in both state courts and in federal courts, both trial court judges and appellate court judges who had to take up the issue of whether Donald Trump's, speech and his posts are so violence-inducing, so dangerous that he needs to have a limited gag order placed on him. Every single judge has ruled, you're damn right he does, and it withstands appeal over and over and over again, and now it is a completely settled question in the courts of New York. I guess better late than never, because he's got a sentencing date coming up in just 3 weeks or so on July 11th, but the gag order will remain in full effect until the time he is sentenced.
And that was my question. Was this ruling to just determine whether the gag order was actually valid, which seems kind of moot at this point, or was it really just to determine whether that gag order could remain in place until that July 11th sentencing?
Yeah, it was a little of both, because what happened was Judge Merchan instituted the gag order to try to protect everybody that Donald Trump was endangering during the course of his New York State Court prosecution. Donald Trump appealed that to the first appellate court in New York, and some time ago, they rejected Donald Trump's appeal, saying, and I quote, Judge Merchan properly weighed Trump's First Amendment rights against the court's responsibility to ensure the fair administration of justice in criminal cases and the right of persons related to the proceedings to be free from threats, intimidation, harassment, and harm. That was the ruling of the first Court of Appeals in New York. And then back during his trial, when Donald Trump was actually being tried for the 34 felony counts indicted against him, he appealed that to the highest court in New York State. That is the ruling we just got. So it's a little bit of a delayed ruling, but it does mean that this gag order will remain in effect through the life of the case, which will terminate come sentencing time on July 11th.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but is the reason that this is so significant because all of his contempt charges against him, I think there were 10 or 11, were predicated on his violations of the gag order. So he was hoping that the gag order wouldn't have been valid, and so that would kind of retroactively eliminate those contempt charges, which, by the way, could be taken into account when sentencing comes around. But because the highest court in New York then ruled that the gag order is valid, can stay in effect, it would then mean that those contempt charges also remain in effect and can play a factor here when sentencing rolls around in
a legal breakdown law degree, because it's such an important point, but there's actually a pretty nuanced area of the law when it comes to somebody who violates a court order. Let's talk about that. You're absolutely right. Given that the highest court in New York has now affirmed the legality and constitutionality of Judge Merchan's gag order of Donald Trump, it makes it that much easier moving forward, come sentencing time, for Judge Merchan to say, yeah, and by the way, I found you in criminal contempt 10 times, 10 counts, for violating my gag order that the highest court in our state just said was lawful and constitutional. That's important. But here's the thing. The law actually requires somebody to obey a court order even while that court order is involved in appellate litigation. Because otherwise you could kind of say, well, I've appealed it, so now I guess I get to violate the gag order or any court order with impunity. So interestingly, there's a body of case law, appellate court case law, precedent, that says you must obey it. And if you are found to be in violation, even if some higher court ultimately rules that the court order suffered from some infirmity, you could still be held accountable for violating that court order. So it's an interesting area of the law, but you kind of hit right on the most important point.
And can you just build on that a little bit more, the implications that Donald Trump violating this gag order 11 times, racking up those contempt charges 10 or 11 times during the trial, the impact that may have on sentencing when that rolls around?
it should have an enormous impact, and I hope it does. Only Judge Merchan knows for sure how he will weigh it in to the sentencing calculation. But, you know, every judge has an absolute responsibility to control their proceedings and to make sure that nobody interferes in either the due administration of justice or, you know, threatening, harassing, intimidating anybody else who's associated with the proceedings, like witnesses, jurors, judges, prosecutors, etc. So Judge Merchan placed that gag order on Donald Trump, and he violated it 10 times. That's 10 separate criminal offenses. And Judge Merchan found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of those 10 crimes of contempt of court. That's mind-blowing. Brian, in my 30 years as a prosecutor, I don't think I ever had it happen once. Never mind 10 times during the course of a trial. If that does not persuade Judge Merchan that Donald Trump has no regard for the rule of law, has no regard for judicial authority, has no regard for the safety of everybody who's involved in the endeavor of trying to hold